The castle was not quite the palace you imagine. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back through the stone gates of a medieval royal castle. So, wherever you are, get comfortable. Let the room become a little darker. Put your phone somewhere slightly less tempting. If you can manage that particular medieval feat of self-control and settle in. Tonight, we are going to spend a long, quiet night inside a royal castle. Not the castle from a fairy tale. Not the spotless stone palace with enormous empty rooms, perfectly polished armor, and a princess gazing thoughtfully from a tower window. The real thing was rather more complicated. A medieval royal castle could be magnificent, certainly. It could have thick walls, decorated chambers, chapels, gardens, great halls, expensive tapestries, and enough servants moving around to make privacy almost impossible. It could also be cold. It could be smoky. It could smell rather strongly of cooking, animals, rushes, damp stone, and several hundred people who did not have modern plumbing. And that was the home of kings and queens, which sounds considerably less glamorous once you think about it. The first thing to understand is that a royal castle was not simply a house. It was a machine. It was a military stronghold, administrative center, warehouse, courtroom, chapel, residence, workplace, political theater, and occasional prison. Sometimes all of these things were happening at once. A king might be eating dinner in the Great Hall while officials discussed taxes. Nearby, servants carried food through the room, guards stood at the doors, musicians played somewhere in the background, and a messenger waited patiently for an opportunity to deliver news from another part of the kingdom. So when we imagine medieval royalty sitting quietly beside a fireplace, enjoying a peaceful evening with the family, we should perhaps add about 30 people to the room, and another 20 somewhere behind them, because royal privacy was a difficult thing to achieve. Let's begin at the entrance. Imagine approaching a large royal castle in the later Middle Ages. You would first encounter walls, very large walls. The point was, after all, to make attacking the place unpleasant. Towers rose above the curtain walls. There might be a moat, although not every castle had one. There could be drawbridges, gates, portcullises, and narrow passages designed to control movement. The entrance was not just a doorway. It was a statement. The message was simple. If you were arriving peacefully, you were welcome. If you were arriving with an army, perhaps you might reconsider. Once through the gate, though, you would find that the castle was not one enormous building. It was usually a collection of spaces. There might be an inner ward, outer ward, kitchens, stables, workshops, storehouses, gardens, wells, chapels, accommodation for servants, and several large buildings connected by courtyards. The exact arrangement varied enormously. A modest castle and a major royal residence were very different places, and medieval castles changed over time. A fortress built primarily for defense might later be expanded into a comfortable royal residence. New chambers could be added. Windows could become larger. Decorative fireplaces could replace older, simpler heating arrangements. Tapestries could be hung over walls. Floors could be covered with rushes or other materials. The castle was constantly being repaired, altered, cleaned, supplied, and occasionally rebuilt. because stone buildings have the unfortunate habit of requiring maintenance. Inside, the Great Hall was often one of the most important spaces. This was where much of public life happened. Meals were served here. Visitors were received here. Ceremonies took place here. Important decisions could be announced here. Courts might be held here. And depending on the castle, members of the household might sleep in or around the hall as well. The Great Hall was usually large, but it was not necessarily comfortable. High ceilings were impressive. They were less impressive when you were trying to keep warm. Heat rose. Smoke could be a problem. Large fireplaces helped. But they did not magically transform a medieval stone hall into a modern living room. In winter, you might be very aware that you were surrounded by stone. The royal family had better clothing, better bedding, and access to more fireplaces than ordinary people. But being rich did not repeal the laws of physics. Cold remained cold. The king could own 100 blankets and still wake up on a January morning, wondering why the floor had, apparently, become a sheet of ice. Of course, castles were not always freezing. During summer, thick walls could actually be useful. They helped moderate temperatures. But sunlight, ventilation, fires, cooking, and crowded rooms created their own problems. And then there was the smell. Medieval people were not unaware of hygiene. This is important. They bathed. They washed their hands and faces. They changed clothing. They used various methods to keep themselves and their surroundings reasonably clean. But sanitation was obviously nothing like modern sanitation. There were no bathrooms with running hot water. There were garderobes, privies, chamber pots, drains, and other arrangements. Some castles had surprisingly sophisticated waste systems. Others were considerably less impressive. A garderobe might project from the wall, allowing waste to fall outside the building. Sometimes it dropped into a pit, sometimes into a moat or drainage area, and sometimes the arrangement was simply unpleasant. Castle builders understood that waste needed somewhere to go. They did not, however, possess the modern infrastructure that allows us to flush the problem away and immediately forget about it. So living in a royal castle involved a constant relationship with unpleasant practical realities, which brings us back to the royal family. Because the king and queen were not living separately from the machinery of the castle, they were at the center of it. A medieval monarch's household could include servants, cooks, chamberlains, chaplains, clerks, guards, messengers, musicians, physicians, laundresses, grooms, falconers, and many others. The household was not simply a collection of people employed to make life convenient. It was part of the political structure. Who served the king mattered. Who could enter the royal chamber mattered. Who carried messages mattered. Who controlled access to the monarch mattered. A servant could sometimes know more about a king's private habits than an important nobleman who saw him only during formal occasions. And this created a strange contradiction. The king was among the most powerful people in Europe, yet he could rarely be completely alone. If the monarch wanted to sleep, someone might be nearby. If the monarch wanted to eat, servants were present. If the monarch wanted to travel, a whole household might move with him. If the monarch became ill, physicians and attendants appeared. Royal life was public even when it was supposed to be private. The bedchamber was particularly important. We tend to think of a bedroom as the most private room in a house. For medieval royalty, that was not always true. The royal bedchamber could be a political space. Certain people were permitted access, others were not. Being close to the king while he dressed, ate, prayed, or prepared for bed could be a sign of status. A chamberlain could hold enormous, practical influence simply because he was physically close to the monarch. The same was true for queens. Royal women had their own households and attendants. Ladies in waiting could accompany them closely throughout the day. So even something as ordinary as getting dressed could become a public event. Imagine waking up and knowing that your clothing is being prepared by other people. Your hair is arranged by other people. Your meals arrive through other people. Your schedule is managed by other people. Your letters are handled by other people. Your children are often cared for by other people. And if you are the monarch, many of those people are also watching you for signs of political importance. It would make even a simple bad mood potentially significant. The king had slept badly. Was he angry? Was he ill? Had someone offended him? Was he planning to dismiss an official? Or perhaps he was simply tired. Unfortunately, in medieval politics, nobody was always willing to assume the simple explanation. Royal children had a similar experience. A prince or princess might grow up surrounded by servants and tutors. Their education could be carefully arranged. They might learn languages, religion, history, music, manners, writing, hunting, and other skills expected of their position. But childhood at court was not necessarily carefree. Children were political assets. Marriage plans could be discussed while they were still very young. Their future could already be connected to alliances between kingdoms. A prince might be expected to become a military leader. A princess might be promised in marriage to strengthen a diplomatic relationship. And everyone around them knew that their future mattered. Still, children were children. They became bored. They argued. They played. They complained. They became sick. They missed their parents. They formed attachments to servants and nurses. And sometimes they were sent away from their parents because medieval royal households often distributed children among different residences. The castle, then, was a strange environment. It could be luxurious by contemporary standards and uncomfortable by ours. It could be secure and yet politically dangerous. It could be full of people and yet emotionally lonely. And perhaps most strangely, it could feel both enormous and claustrophobic. A king might look across his kingdom from the top of a tower, but inside the castle, there were doors he could not simply open, people he could not casually dismiss, rules he had to follow, ceremonies he had to perform, and expectations that followed him everywhere. The medieval castle was not merely where the royal family lived. It was where they performed being royal. Every meal could be a display. Every procession could be a display. Every visitor could become part of a diplomatic calculation. Even the arrangement of chairs could communicate hierarchy. And so, as the evening settles over our imaginary castle, the great hall slowly becomes quieter. The fire continues to burn. Servants carry away the last dishes. Guards remain at the doors. Somewhere above, the royal family retreats toward its chambers. The castle does not sleep completely. It rarely could. There were always people on duty. Someone had to watch the gates. Someone had to tend the fires. Someone had to care for the horses. Someone had to prepare food for the next morning. Someone had to answer messages. Someone had to make sure the household continued functioning. And tomorrow, everyone would do it again. Because royal life was not simply crowns and banquets. It was schedules, maintenance, cold mornings, long journeys, political arguments, illness, waiting, and an almost endless procession of people asking the king to make decisions. So, with the fire quietly burning in the great hall, let's drift a little deeper into the castle, because there is one thing we have not yet considered: the people who made this enormous household function. And there were a great many of them. Part 2. The people who were always around. By morning, the castle would already be awake. Not necessarily the king. Kings were occasionally allowed to sleep. The building itself, however, had no such luxury. Fires needed tending. Animals needed feeding. Water needed carrying. Bread needed baking. Meat needed preparing. Messages needed delivering. And somewhere, probably rather early, someone had to begin preparing breakfast. The medieval royal household depended on an enormous amount of labor. This is one of the easiest things to overlook when imagining royal life. We see the finished castle. We see the king sitting at a table. We see the expensive clothing and silverware. We see the tapestry on the wall. What we do not immediately see are the people who made all of it possible. There were cooks, many cooks. In a major royal household, the kitchens could be substantial operations. They might include cooks, assistants, bakers, brewers, scullions, servers, and people responsible for obtaining and storing ingredients. Food did not simply appear. Someone had to acquire it. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to inspect it. Someone had to prepare it. Someone had to cook it. And someone had to clean up afterward. The royal kitchen could be a busy and sometimes dangerous place. There were open fires, heavy pots, knives, boiling liquids, animals being butchered, and a great deal of heat. If you have ever complained about cooking dinner after a long day, imagine doing it next to a giant medieval fireplace while preparing food for hundreds of people. Naturally, they made it more complicated. Royal feasts could involve elaborate dishes: meat, fish, bread, vegetables, fruit, dairy products, spices, and wine or ale might appear depending on season, location, wealth, and religious restrictions. Spices could be particularly valuable. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and other imported ingredients were expensive. Using them was not simply about flavor. It could also demonstrate wealth. The meal itself was a performance. The king's food was served in a particular order. Important guests had their places. Servants knew who should be served first, and the entire arrangement reinforced hierarchy. You did not simply sit down wherever you liked. That would have been rather awkward. Imagine a medieval courtier confidently taking the best seat at dinner and discovering that the seat had been reserved for the king's uncle. A small mistake could become a large social problem. Royal dining also involved security. Food could theoretically be poisoned. Actual poisoning was probably less common than popular stories suggest, but fear of poisoning was real. High-status people sometimes had trusted servants taste or handle food. Cupbearers and other household officers could have important responsibilities. But medieval people also understood that illness could come from spoiled food, contaminated water, or ordinary disease. The world did not need assassins to make someone sick. It had bacteria. It had parasites. It had epidemics. And it had absolutely no concept of antibiotics. So the castle kitchen was both a place of abundance and a place where careful management mattered. After food came another problem: waste. A royal household produced plenty of it: bones, ash, food scraps, dirty water, human waste, animal waste, broken pottery, old straw, and various other things that nobody wanted sitting around indefinitely. Servants dealt with these problems. This was not glamorous work, but medieval society depended on it. The same was true for laundry. Royal clothing might be expensive, elaborate, and difficult to clean. Cloth could be made from wool, linen, silk, or other materials depending on status and period. Clothing could be brushed, aired, washed, repaired, and reused. People often changed linen garments more frequently than heavy outer garments. Linen could be valuable precisely because it was washable, and washing clothing was hard work. It required water. It required time. It required labor. There was no washing machine waiting politely in the corner. Someone had to do it by hand, which means that when a king appeared at court wearing a beautifully maintained garment, dozens of hours of invisible labor might be represented in that one piece of clothing. The same was true of bedding. Royal beds were important. They were expensive. They could include mattresses stuffed with various materials, sheets, blankets, curtains, and decorative fabrics. The bed itself could be a status symbol, but even a magnificent bed still needed cleaning and maintenance. And the castle needed enormous amounts of fabric. Tapestries were not simply decorations. They could help keep rooms warmer by reducing drafts against stone walls. They could also be transported. A traveling monarch might take valuable tapestries from one residence to another. This is one reason medieval royal residences could appear rather different depending on the season. The building remained, the household moved, and sometimes the decorations moved with it. The royal court was often itinerant. This means that a king did not necessarily spend his entire reign sitting comfortably in one castle. He traveled. He might move between castles, palaces, hunting residences, administrative centers, and other estates. This created an enormous logistical challenge. Imagine packing your entire household for a weekend away. Now multiply that by hundreds of people, and then add horses, food, furniture, documents, clothing, weapons, tents, cooking equipment, treasures, religious objects, and whatever else the court needed. Royal travel was not a holiday. It was government on the road. When the king arrived somewhere, local officials might have to provide supplies. This could place a burden on communities. The royal household had to be fed. Horses had to be fed. Rooms had to be prepared. Fuel had to be gathered. The arrival of the king could, therefore, be both an honor and an enormous inconvenience, especially if several hundred hungry people arrived with him. And this brings us to another group of people who were always present: officials. A medieval kingdom required administration. There were clerks writing documents, treasurers handling money, judges hearing cases, messengers carrying letters, chamberlains managing household affairs, secretaries and scribes producing records. The castle could, therefore, contain a surprising amount of paperwork. This is another thing modern images of castles often omit: ink, parchment, seals, charters, accounts, lists, letters, orders, receipts. The medieval state was not entirely made of swords. It was also made of paperwork. Someone had to record how much grain had arrived. Someone had to know how many horses were available. Someone had to track expenses. Someone had to document land grants. Someone had to write letters to nobles. Someone had to copy legal documents. And somebody had to keep all of these things from becoming hopelessly disorganized. The clerks probably did not receive the same cinematic treatment as knights. But without them, the kingdom would have had a difficult time functioning. And then there were guards. Castle guards were essential. Some guarded gates. Others patrolled walls. Some watched important rooms. Weapons might be stored securely. The royal family needed protection, particularly during politically unstable periods. Yet guards also became part of the rhythm of everyday life. There would be shifts. There would be routine. There would be moments of boredom. A guard standing on a wall at midnight might not spend his entire shift dramatically, scanning the horizon for an approaching army. He might mostly be cold and tired and wondering when the next shift would begin. This is one of the quieter realities of medieval life. Most of history was not dramatic. Most people were not constantly fighting battles. Most nights were simply nights. The castle guard listened to the wind. The fire burned. A servant carried a bucket. A horse moved inside a stable. Someone whispered in a corridor. And somewhere, a royal official was probably complaining about paperwork. The castle could be remarkably ordinary, even though the people living inside it were not. Royal households also included entertainers, musicians, poets, jesters, performers. Their presence reminds us that medieval courts were not places of permanent seriousness. People wanted entertainment. Kings could enjoy music. Queens could enjoy stories. Courtiers could listen to poetry. Games were played. Hunting was popular among elites. Falconry could be an important courtly activity, and celebrations could become elaborate. But even entertainment had political meaning. A royal feast showed generosity. A tournament displayed noble culture and martial skill. A procession demonstrated power. A hunting expedition could reinforce relationships between the king and his nobles. Almost everything at court could become symbolic, even relaxation. And perhaps that was one of the strangest parts of royal life. There was very little that was entirely private. A king could hunt, but people accompanied him. He could eat, but servants watched. He could pray, but the royal chapel was part of court life. He could travel, but hundreds of people might move with him. He could sleep, but attendants were often nearby. The king was surrounded, constantly, and yet surrounded by people. He might still be lonely. That contradiction will follow us through the castle tonight. Because the higher someone stood in the medieval hierarchy, the more carefully controlled their life could become. And nowhere was this more obvious than in marriage. For a medieval king or queen, marriage was rarely just about love. It was about land, inheritance, alliances, diplomacy, children, and, occasionally, disastrous family politics. So as the morning light reaches the castle walls, let's drift toward the royal chambers, because this is where the personal side of royal life becomes even stranger. Part 3: Marriage, Children, and the Royal Family. A medieval royal marriage could begin with a conversation between people who had never met. This is not quite as romantic as the modern idea of falling in love, but it was often practical. A king might need an alliance. A noble family might want influence. A kingdom might need peace. A disputed territory might be settled through marriage, and so two people could become husband and wife because their families had decided that it was politically convenient. Naturally, everyone hoped they would get along, but history was not particularly interested in making that easy. Royal marriages could be affectionate. Some couples appear to have developed genuine companionship. Others clearly had strained relationships, and some marriages became political disasters. The problem was that royal couples rarely had the luxury of simply separating from each other. Their relationship affected succession. Their children mattered. Their families mattered. Their kingdoms mattered. A private argument could have public consequences. Imagine having an ordinary marital disagreement. Now imagine that everyone at work is watching. Then imagine that half of them are related to your spouse. Then imagine that your marriage determines who inherits a kingdom. That was the basic difficulty. Queens, in particular, had complicated roles. A queen could be expected to produce heirs. She might manage her own household. She could participate in religious patronage. She could act as a political intermediary. She could sometimes rule as regent when the king was absent or when a child inherited the throne. But she was also living within a system that placed enormous importance on fertility. A royal pregnancy was not simply a family event. It could become a matter of national interest. Courtiers wanted to know whether the queen was pregnant. They wanted to know when the child was due. They wanted to know whether the child was a boy or girl. And after the birth, the succession question immediately returned. If the child was a boy, everyone could celebrate. If the child was a girl, the political consequences depended heavily on the laws and customs of the kingdom. And if there were no surviving children, the problem became even more complicated. Royal women could therefore experience enormous pressure. Pregnancy itself was dangerous. Childbirth was dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited. Infections were common. A woman could survive one pregnancy and die during another. And royal wealth could not guarantee safety. Physicians might be available. Midwives could be experienced. But there were limits to what medieval medicine could do. Royal children also faced danger. Child mortality was high across medieval society. It affected poor families and wealthy families alike. Although wealth could provide better food, care, shelter, and access to medical practitioners, still, childhood illness could become fatal very quickly. A royal nursery could therefore be a place of great hope and great anxiety. Children were surrounded by nurses, servants, tutors, and guardians. Their parents might love them deeply, but royal parents were not always physically close to their children. They might travel. They might have political responsibilities. They might send children to other residences. And as the children grew older, they were gradually introduced to the responsibilities expected of them. A prince might learn riding and hunting. He might study religion and law. He could be taught how to behave at court. A princess might receive instruction in household management, religion, languages, music, and courtly behavior. But these expectations varied enormously. There was no single medieval childhood. A royal child in 12th century England did not necessarily experience the same childhood as a royal child in 15th century Castile. The Middle Ages lasted for roughly 1,000 years. People sometimes talk about medieval life, as though everyone lived in the same way for 1,000 years. They did not. A castle in 1100 and a palace in 1450 could be radically different. Architecture changed, clothing changed, military technology changed, medical ideas changed, social customs changed, and royal households changed with them. Still, certain patterns remained. One was the importance of inheritance. The entire royal system depended heavily on succession. Who would inherit? When? Under what rules? What if there were multiple sons? What if the king died while the heir was a child? What if a daughter inherited? What if someone claimed that the existing heir was illegitimate? These questions could become catastrophically important. And this is where royal family trees become rather uncomfortable, because medieval dynasties often married within the European aristocracy. That does not mean every medieval royal was dramatically inbred, but over many generations, elite families were interconnected. The same ancestors could appear repeatedly in family trees. Marriage between relatives was not always unusual among dynasties. Although church law placed restrictions on degrees of kinship and dispensations could be required, the political logic was understandable. If you wanted to marry someone powerful, they were likely to be related to you somehow. The European aristocracy was a fairly interconnected network, so a royal wedding could involve two people who shared ancestors several generations earlier. Sometimes closer relationships occurred, and the consequences could be complicated. Modern discussions of royal inbreeding often focus heavily on later dynasties, especially the Habsburgs. But medieval dynastic marriage was a much broader phenomenon. The goal was usually not to produce unhealthy children. Nobody was thinking, let us carefully create the most complicated family tree possible. The goal was political: land, inheritance, alliances, peace, status. Unfortunately, biology does not care about political strategy. Certain hereditary conditions become more likely when closely related people have children. But we should be careful not to diagnose historical individuals casually. Modern historians cannot examine a medieval king and simply announce that every unusual feature was caused by inbreeding. Historical evidence is often incomplete. Portraits may be stylized. Descriptions may be exaggerated. Political enemies could insult rulers. And medieval writers loved moral interpretations. A king who behaved badly might be described as physically monstrous. A saintly ruler might be described as unusually beautiful. The truth was probably somewhere between the propaganda and the insults. Royal appearance itself could become political. A ruler's body represented the dynasty. If a king was tall, strong, handsome, or physically impressive, chroniclers might mention it. If he was sickly, they might mention that too. And illness could become a political problem. A chronically ill monarch might struggle to travel. He might struggle to fight. He might rely heavily on advisors. His enemies could interpret illness as weakness. Even a perfectly capable ruler could become vulnerable. If everyone around him believed he was incapable, the royal body was therefore public property in a strange political sense. The king's health was everyone's business. The queen's fertility was everyone's business. The heir's survival was everyone's business. and the royal family's private arguments could become political news. Imagine trying to have a family disagreement while knowing that the result might affect an entire kingdom. It was not an especially relaxing family environment, yet people still found ways to be petty. Royal history contains quarrels over money, quarrels over precedence, quarrels over titles, quarrels over marriages, quarrels over inheritance, quarrels over who had offended whom at dinner. The medieval world could be extraordinarily formal, and because it was so formal, small breaches of etiquette could sometimes feel enormous. Who entered a room first? Who sat closest to the monarch? Who received a particular gift? Who was allowed to speak? Who was invited to a ceremony? These things communicated status. A nobleman could be furious because someone else received a seat that he believed belonged to him. It sounds ridiculous, and perhaps it was, but status was one of the currencies of court. Everyone knew their place, and everyone knew when someone else was being given more of it. So as night returns to our imaginary castle, we can picture the royal family gathering again. The king has finished his business. The queen has retired to her chambers. The children have been attended by their nurses and servants. Courtiers continue whispering in corridors. And somewhere, a clerk is still writing, because medieval administration apparently had no bedtime. The castle settles, but the royal family is not necessarily sleeping. There are letters to read, visitors to consider, prayers to say, plans for tomorrow, and perhaps a minor disagreement waiting patiently to become a major political problem. Let's drift onward. Because if the castle was the royal home, it was also a workplace, and perhaps the most exhausting. Part of royal life was that the work never really stopped. Part 4. A royal day that was never quite private. A medieval king did not necessarily wake up and immediately begin ruling the kingdom. There was usually a routine. The exact routine depended on the person, the period, and the court. But religion was central to medieval royal life. Prayer structured the day. The royal chapel could be an important part of the castle. Mass might be attended. Religious observances marked time. The church calendar shaped celebrations and restrictions. So the day could begin with worship before the king moved into the more practical business of government. Breakfast followed, and then came administration, petitions, letters, visitors, reports, legal matters, financial issues, military concerns, diplomatic messages, land disputes, complaints from nobles, requests from clergy, and occasionally, someone arriving with news that a neighboring ruler had done something deeply irritating. Kings were expected to govern. That sounds obvious. But governing a medieval kingdom without modern communications was difficult. There were no telephones, no instant messages, no email, no television, no satellite imagery. If the king wanted information from a distant region, somebody had to physically carry that information to him. A messenger might travel for days or weeks. Weather could slow travel. Roads could be poor. Bandits could be a problem. Horses could become exhausted. And the message could become outdated before it arrived. Imagine receiving an urgent message saying that something terrible had happened 3 weeks ago. At least you knew. Eventually, the king's court therefore depended on networks of messengers and officials. Written documents were important. Seals authenticated documents. Clerks copied records. Royal chancelleries produced an enormous amount of administrative material, and much of this work happened quietly. There was no dramatic soundtrack, just people writing. Scratch of a quill. Pause. Dip the pen. Write again. Perhaps one of the least exciting jobs in medieval history. And yet, without it, royal government would have been nearly impossible. The king might then meet nobles. This could be pleasant, or not. Nobles were powerful people with their own interests. They might support the king. They might oppose him. They might request favors. They might complain. They might compete with each other. And kings had to manage these relationships carefully. A monarch who insulted a powerful noble could create a serious political problem. A monarch who rewarded one family too generously could anger another. Royal government was therefore partly an exercise in balancing personalities. And personalities are notoriously difficult to balance. Then there was justice. Kings were expected to uphold justice. Royal courts could hear important cases. But medieval justice was complicated. Different people had different legal rights. Different regions had different customs. Church courts existed alongside secular courts. Nobles could possess particular privileges. Local communities had their own systems. The king was not necessarily personally hearing every dispute. Officials handled much of the work. Still, royal justice was part of the image of kingship. A good king was supposed to be just. A bad king was often described as arbitrary, cruel, or greedy. Chroniclers loved this contrast. Medieval writers frequently interpreted political events through morality. If a king lost a battle, perhaps it was because God was displeased. If a king succeeded, perhaps God favored him. This was not merely superstition. Religion was part of how medieval people understood the world. So royal success could carry spiritual meaning. The king also needed to display generosity. Gifts were important. A monarch might reward loyal followers with land, money, offices, clothing, horses, or other valuables. Generosity helped maintain loyalty, but kings had limited resources. Even wealthy monarchs could run short of money. Wars were expensive. Castles were expensive. Households were expensive. Diplomacy was expensive. And royal generosity could become a financial headache. A king might spend heavily on a war and then need to raise taxes. Taxes could anger subjects. Angry subjects could become rebellious. Rebellion could require soldiers. Soldiers cost money. And suddenly the king was back where he started. Naturally, they made it worse. Royal extravagance is therefore difficult to understand without remembering the political purpose of display. A king needed to look powerful. If he appeared poor, his authority could suffer. If his court looked magnificent, visitors understood that he possessed resources. Food was abundant. Clothing was rich. Ceremonies were impressive. The palace was decorated. The message was, this kingdom has power. This ruler has wealth. This dynasty is secure, even when it wasn't. And medieval rulers sometimes had to maintain the appearance of stability during periods of genuine uncertainty. A royal court could therefore be full of people smiling politely while quietly worrying about succession, or war, or debt, or disease, or rebellion, or the king's health. The castle might look peaceful from outside. Inside, everyone could be calculating who supported whom, who was gaining influence, who had lost favor, who had received a royal appointment, who was suddenly spending more time near the king. Court politics were rarely simple. And because everyone was physically close together, rumors could travel quickly. A servant might hear something in the kitchen. A courtier might hear it in the corridor. A noble might hear it during dinner. By evening, the story could have become almost unrecognizable. Medieval castles were therefore also information networks. People watched. People listened. People talked. They wrote letters. They carried news. They interpreted expressions. They tried to predict royal intentions. And sometimes they were completely wrong, which is probably comforting. Even in a world without social media, people were still capable of misunderstanding each other. Now, after a long day of government, the king might turn towards something more enjoyable. Hunting was one possibility. Hunting was not merely sport. For nobles, it could be an important expression of status and military culture. It required skill. It provided food. It offered an opportunity to spend time with other nobles, and it allowed the king to escape the castle for a while. But even hunting was political. The king did not simply disappear into the forest. A hunting party could include companions, servants, handlers, guards, and equipment. Horses had to be prepared. Dogs might be brought. Falcons required care. Food had to be carried. And if the king caught something impressive, everyone would know about it. Perhaps the most relaxing activity was simply walking. A garden, courtyard, or enclosed park could provide some privacy. Royal gardens existed in various forms. They might include herbs, flowers, fruit trees, lawns, or pleasure spaces. Gardens were valuable not just for beauty, but also for food and medicine. Yet even there, complete privacy was difficult. A king could walk alone for a few minutes. Then someone would probably find him. "My lord, there is a message." Of course there was. There was always a message. And so the royal day continued. Eventually, evening arrived. Dinner, conversation, entertainment, prayer, then bed. Except bedtime was not necessarily the end of the day. Guards continued working. Servants remained awake. Fires needed attention. The household might receive visitors late, and the king could be awakened by news. A medieval royal castle never completely switched off. It was more like a large machine that slowed down at night. The gates closed. Torches burned. The halls became quieter. Footsteps echoed through stone corridors. A guard stood at the entrance. A servant carried a final bucket. And somewhere behind a heavy wooden door, the royal family tried to sleep. The castle had become peaceful, but peaceful did not mean silent. There was wind. There were animals. There were footsteps. There was the occasional creak of timber. There might be bells from the chapel. There could be voices from servants working late. For a modern person used to electrical silence and climate-controlled rooms, it would be a very different kind of night. And tomorrow, the entire routine would begin again. Part 5. When the castle became uncomfortable. For all its grandeur, the medieval castle was not designed primarily for comfort. It was designed around the needs of defense, status, administration, and practical survival. Comfort came somewhere in the middle. This becomes especially obvious in winter. Imagine a large stone room. The walls are thick. The windows are relatively small. A fire burns at one end, and you are standing several meters away from it. You may feel warm on one side of your body. The other side is negotiating with winter. Medieval people adapted. They wore layers. They used blankets. They burned wood or other fuels. They hung textiles on walls. They arranged rooms around fireplaces. They moved toward warmth. But the fundamental problem remained. Stone is not particularly interested in your emotional well-being. Royal chambers could be more comfortable than those of ordinary people. There might be better fireplaces, better bedding, more curtains, more clothing, more servants. But even wealthy people experienced cold. And then came damp. Moisture was a persistent problem in many medieval buildings. Rain, snow, condensation, leaks, groundwater, poor ventilation. A castle could require constant maintenance. Roof tiles broke, wood rotted, stonework needed repair, doors warped, windows needed attention, fireplaces required cleaning, and all of this required labor. The larger the castle, the larger the maintenance problem. A royal castle could consume enormous amounts of resources: timber, stone, food, fuel, candles, cloth, metal, glass, and human labor. A magnificent residence did not simply exist. Someone was always repairing it. This also explains why medieval castles could change so much over time. A room might be remodeled. A tower might receive new windows. A fireplace could be enlarged. A new building could be attached. An old defensive feature might become less important. As warfare changed, architecture changed. As royal tastes changed, decoration changed. As money became available, improvements were made. As money disappeared, maintenance could become more difficult. And sometimes a castle simply became old. The romantic image of a castle often assumes that every stone was deliberately preserved, exactly as it had always been. In reality, medieval people were constantly modifying old buildings. They were not living inside museum pieces. They were living inside working structures. There were also animals. Lots of animals. Horses were essential. Royal stables could be substantial. Horses transported people. They carried soldiers. They pulled carts. They were used for hunting. They were symbols of status. A valuable horse could be extremely expensive, and horses needed food, water, grooming, and care. Then there were dogs, hunting dogs, guard dogs, other working animals, birds of prey, chickens, perhaps pigs or cattle depending on the location. Animals were not necessarily kept inside the main residential areas, but they were part of castle life, and animals produce waste. Which brings us back to sanitation. A medieval castle was a human environment surrounded by animals. The smell was not optional. People were accustomed to smells that modern urban populations might find overwhelming. This does not mean medieval people enjoyed dirt. It means their baseline expectations were different. They knew that clean clothing was pleasant. They knew that washing was useful. They knew that bad smells could indicate something unhealthy. But their ability to control the environment was limited. Even the royal family could not simply eliminate every unpleasant smell. Then there were insects, fleas, lice, bedbugs, flies. Medieval people had various methods of dealing with them. Clothing could be cleaned. Bedding could be aired. Herbs and other substances might be used. But infestations were a recurring reality. A luxurious bed could still contain fleas. This is one of those moments when medieval royalty becomes strangely relatable. You can have expensive curtains. You can have a crown. You can have servants. And the flea remains unimpressed. Medical care was another major problem. Royal households could employ physicians, but medieval medicine was based on theories very different from modern biomedical science. Ideas about the body's humors were influential. Illness could be understood through imbalance. Treatment might involve diet, bloodletting, herbal remedies, rest, prayer, or other interventions. Some remedies were probably useful, others were ineffective. Some could be harmful, but it is important not to imagine medieval medicine as completely foolish. Medieval physicians observed patients. They recorded symptoms. They studied older medical traditions. They understood some practical aspects of injury and disease. Surgery existed. Herbal knowledge was extensive. Midwives possessed practical experience. Yet they lacked modern understanding of microorganisms, antibiotics, anesthesia, and many other things we now consider basic. So illness remained frightening. A minor infection could become serious. A cut could become dangerous. Childbirth could become deadly. And epidemics could move through populations with devastating speed. Royal castles were not immune. In fact, when large households gathered together, disease could spread easily. Crowded rooms, shared spaces, travelers arriving from different regions, servants moving between buildings, food and water systems, all created opportunities for illness. And this meant that one of the great advantages of royal life, having a large household, could sometimes become a disadvantage. The castle could protect people from enemies outside. It could also bring many people together inside. During epidemics, rulers sometimes moved. They could leave affected areas, but servants and local populations could not always do the same. This created another contradiction. Royal power could provide escape, but it could not provide immunity. Disease did not care about titles. A king could command soldiers. He could collect taxes. He could build castles. He could not order an infection to stop. And when a monarch became sick, the political consequences could be enormous. Who would rule if he died? Who would inherit? Would there be a regency? Would rival nobles fight? Would neighboring rulers take advantage? A fever could therefore become a political event. The same was true of injury. A king who fell from a horse might be unable to rule effectively. A wound could keep him in bed. A chronic illness could limit travel. The royal body was a political body, and so everyone watched. Everyone worried. Everyone offered advice. Some advice was probably better than others. Naturally, there were also moments when medieval people simply accepted discomfort as part of life. This is easy to forget. Modern life has trained us to expect convenience. We expect warm rooms, clean water, reliable lighting, private bathrooms, refrigeration, fast communication, medical care. Medieval people did not have these things, yet they still built families. They still laughed. They still ate good meals. They still enjoyed music. They still complained about the weather. They still found ways to make their surroundings pleasant. They planted gardens. They decorated rooms. They wore beautiful clothing. They told stories. They played games. They prayed. They celebrated festivals. They lived. The castle was uncomfortable by modern standards, but it was home by theirs. And perhaps that is the most useful way to understand medieval royal life. Not as a permanent nightmare, not as a fairy tale, but as ordinary human life surrounded by extraordinary circumstances. People adapted to what they had. They found routines. They created comforts. They got used to things that would seem strange to us. And then, eventually, the day ended. The candles burned lower. The fires settled into embers. The castle became quiet again. A king slept beneath layers of bedding. A servant slept somewhere nearby. A guard remained awake. And beyond the walls, the countryside became dark. Part 6. The quiet reality of royal castle life. By now, our imaginary castle has gone through an entire day. Morning prayers, breakfast, government, messages, meals, visitors, arguments, work, hunting, dinner, and finally, sleep. Yet the strange thing about medieval royal life is that none of this was particularly unusual to the people living it. For them, this was normal. The castle was home. The servants were part of the household. The great hall was familiar. The smell of smoke was familiar. The cold stone was familiar. The sound of horses below was familiar. The bells were familiar. Even the endless stream of people entering and leaving was familiar. What seems extraordinary to us was simply their daily routine. And that is perhaps why the reality is more interesting than the fantasy. Medieval castles were not magical places. They were workplaces. They were homes. They were administrative centers. They were military installations. They were communities. They were sometimes prisons. And they could be lonely. A king might live surrounded by hundreds of people and still spend much of his life performing a role, rather than simply being himself. The crown created distance. People bowed. People waited. People watched. People measured their words. A servant could not always speak to the king as casually as a modern friend might speak to another person. The social hierarchy was constantly present, and the king himself had to behave like a king. There were expectations about clothing, speech, religion, generosity, justice, marriage, military leadership, public appearances. Even facial expressions could be interpreted. If the king looked angry, people wondered why. If he looked tired, people worried. If he favored one courtier, others noticed. If he ignored someone, that could become meaningful. Royal life therefore required constant performance. Queens experienced their own version of this. They had to maintain dignity. They represented the dynasty. They hosted guests. They participated in religious ceremonies. They managed households. They gave birth to heirs. They sometimes acted politically, and they too were watched. The royal children were watched as well. Their behavior could be interpreted as evidence of future character. A troublesome prince might be described as unruly. A quiet prince might be considered thoughtful. A princess's marriage could be discussed years before. She was old enough to understand what marriage meant. The entire family existed inside a political structure. This did not mean that they lacked genuine emotions. They could love each other. They could mourn. They could laugh. They could form friendships. They could dislike one another. They could become jealous. They could forgive. They could hold grudges for decades. They were human. The castle did not remove human nature. It simply surrounded it with politics. And politics could make ordinary emotions dangerous. A family disagreement might divide nobles. A marriage dispute could affect foreign policy. A succession argument could lead to war. A king's favorite could gain enormous influence. A queen's relatives could become powerful at court. A prince could become a political rival to his father. The family dinner could therefore contain more strategic calculations than anyone would like. And yet, after all the politics, Someone still had to clean the plates. That is perhaps the most wonderfully ordinary thing about royal history. Kings could fight wars. Queens could negotiate treaties. Princes could inherit kingdoms. But somebody still had to wash the dishes. Somebody had to sweep the floor. Somebody had to feed the horses. Somebody had to carry firewood. Somebody had to repair the roof. History often remembers the monarch. It rarely remembers the person who carried the bucket. But the castle could not function without that person. The medieval royal household was a giant network of labor. Every impressive ceremony depended on invisible preparation. Every feast depended on cooks. Every royal journey depended on grooms and transport workers. Every warm room depended on fuel. Every clean garment depended on laundry workers. Every official document depended on clerks. Every guarded gate depended on soldiers. Every royal decision depended on messengers and information. The king was the visible center, but the household was the machine. And perhaps this is the best way to imagine the castle as we leave it tonight. Not as a lonely fortress surrounded by mist, not as a glamorous palace full of princesses, but as a living organism. People moving through corridors, doors opening, fires burning, horses shifting in their stalls, clerks writing, servants carrying food, guards changing shifts, children being put to bed, a queen reading a letter, a king listening to a report, someone complaining quietly about the cold, someone else wondering whether there will be enough wood tomorrow, a monk praying in the chapel, a cook preparing something for the morning, and somewhere in a small chamber, a tired servant finally lying down. The castle would never become completely silent, but gradually it would become quieter. The great hall would empty. The last conversations would fade. The torches would burn lower. The guards would continue their rounds. The moon would pass across the stone walls, and the royal family would sleep. Tomorrow, the machinery would start again. Another morning, another meal, another petition, another letter, another disagreement, another decision, another ordinary day inside an extraordinary home. And perhaps, if you had actually lived there, the castle would eventually stop feeling strange. The drafty corridors would be familiar. The bells would wake you without you thinking about them. The smell of smoke would be normal. The servants would know your habits. You would know which staircase creaked. You would know which room was warmest. You would know which door stuck in damp weather. You would know which cook was likely to complain. You would know which guard was always sleepy. And you would probably have your own little routine. Because human beings are remarkably good at turning almost anything into routine. Even living inside a medieval castle. Even being surrounded by kings and queens. Even waking up in a world where a messenger on horseback might arrive with news that could change your entire life. Eventually, it would simply become Tuesday. And perhaps that is the quiet secret of history. The people who lived in these places did not know they were living in the Middle Ages. They did not wake up thinking, "What a fascinating historical period I inhabit." They woke up because the bells rang. They ate because they were hungry. They worked because there was work to do. They worried because there were things to worry about. They laughed because something was funny. They mourned when someone died. They celebrated when a child was born. They complained about taxes. They complained about weather. They complained about their neighbors. And, presumably, They occasionally complained about how cold the castle was, which, honestly, seems reasonable. So, as our little journey through the royal castle comes to an end, imagine those final hours before dawn. The walls are dark. The courtyard is empty. The fire in the great hall has almost disappeared. A few embers glow beneath the ash. The guards continue walking along the walls. Inside the royal chambers, the household is finally still. The king sleeps. The queen sleeps. The children sleep. The servants rest wherever their duties allow. Outside, the countryside is quiet. And for a few hours, nobody needs anything. No petition. No letter. No diplomatic meeting. No feast. No battle. No ceremony. Just sleep. The castle waits. And when morning comes, the bells will ring again. The doors will open. The fires will be rebuilt. The kitchens will wake. The horses will be fed. The clerks will sharpen their quills. The servants will begin carrying things from one room to another. And another day of medieval royal life will begin. For all its crowns and ceremonies. Perhaps that is what life inside a medieval royal castle ultimately was. A long sequence of ordinary moments. Some comfortable, some uncomfortable, some beautiful, some ridiculous, some deeply sad, most simply routine. And beneath all the stone walls, royal titles, political schemes, and elaborate ceremonies were people trying to get through another day, just as people have always done. So, for tonight, we can leave them there. The castle behind us, the fires fading, the corridors quiet, the last guard making his slow journey around the walls, and the medieval night settling gently over the rooftops. Good night, and sleep well.